Good morning everyone, I am Devesh Banerjee, HOD of Electronics and Telecommunication Department. Today I discuss the topic on pulse modulation method. Okay, which is pulse modulation method? In pulse modulation method, the signal is transmitted. The signal is transmitted in the form of pulses. Okay, so it is called the pulse modulation method. The signal is transmitted in the form of pulses. Okay, for this reason, this method is called the pulse modulation method. Okay, so in the pulse modulation method, there are two types of signal are used. Okay, one is carrier signal and another is modulating signal. So here the modulating signal is also called the message signal. Okay, so the modulating signal and carrier signal. Okay, carrier signal. So here the modulating signal is continuous in nature. Okay, continuous in nature. Continuous in nature. But the carrier signal is rectangular pulses. Okay, so in pulse modulation method, the modulating signal is continuous in nature. Okay, and the carrier signal is rectangular pulses. For this reason, this modulation method is called pulse modulation method because the carrier signal is rectangular pulse. So, what are the types of pulse modulation method? Okay, or different types of pulse modulation method. So, pulse modulation, two types. Okay, first is called analog pulse modulation. First is called the analog pulse modulation. Okay, first is called the analog pulse modulation and second is called the digital pulse modulation. Okay, so first is called the analog pulse modulation. First type is analog pulse modulation and second is digital pulse modulation. So what are the example of analog pulse modulation? First is PAM. PAM is the example of analog pulse modulation. So what is the full form of PAM? It's called pulse amplitude. Okay, it's called the pulse amplitude modulation. Okay, the first type of analog pulse modulation is PAM, which is called the pulse amplitude modulation, and second is called the PTM. Okay, second analog pulse modulation is PTM, which is called pulse time modulation. Okay, pulse time modulation. So analog pulse modulation are two types. First is called the PAM, which is called the pulse amplitude modulation, and second is PTM, which is called the pulse time modulation. Here also PTM two types. Okay, there are two types of PTM, or there are two types of pulse time modulation. First is called the PWM. Okay, so PWM is the category of PTM. So PWM is called the and second is ppm. Second is ppm, which is called pulse position modulation. So it is called the pulse position, okay, modulation. So from here we get the pulse modulation. There are two types of pulse modulation: analog pulse modulation and digital pulse modulation. There are two types of analog pulse modulation. Okay, first is called the PAM, which is called the pulse amplitude modulation, and second is called the PTM, pulse time modulation. Here also two types of PTM. First is called the PWM, pulse width modulation, and PPM, pulse position modulation. Okay, this is called the analog pulse modulation. And what is the example or what is the category of digital pulse modulation? First is example of digital pulse modulation is PCM. PCM. Okay, PCM is the example of digital pulse modulation. So what is the full form of PCM? Pulse code modulation. Pulse code modulation. Okay, is the example of digital pulse modulation. Is the example of digital pulse modulation. And second is DM. DM is called the delta modulation. Delta modulation. Okay, so PCM and DM is the example of digital pulse modulation, and PAM, PWM and PPM is the example of analog pulse modulation. Okay, so next, why it is called the analog pulse modulation and why it is called the digital pulse modulation? Okay, so why it is called the analog pulse modulation and why it is called the digital pulse modulation? In the analog pulse modulation, the modulating signal is analog in nature. So in the analog pulse modulation, the modulating signal is analog in nature. Analog in nature. So we know in the modulation technique, there are two types of signal is used. Two types of signal are used. First is called the carrier signal and second is called the modulating signal. So in the analog pulse modulation, the modulating signal is analog in nature, and carrier signal is, what type of carrier is used? Rectangular pulse signal is used as a carrier. So there is a common factor of analog pulse modulation and digital pulse modulation is the carrier. In analog pulse modulation and digital pulse modulation, both the carrier is rectangular pulse. Okay, both the carrier. So it is called the pulse modulation. Okay, in analog pulse modulation and in digital pulse modulation, the carrier signal is rectangular pulse. So it is called the pulse modulation. Okay, we have to think it. And then why it is called the analog pulse modulation and why it is called the digital pulse modulation? Because in analog pulse modulation, the modulating signal is analog in nature, but in digital pulse modulation, the modulating signal is digital in nature. Modulating signal is digital in nature. Okay, digital in nature. So it is called the digital pulse modulation. And here the modulating signal is analog in nature, so it is called the analog pulse modulation. Okay, so here some confusion. Okay, I cleared this confusion. In analog pulse modulation, the modulating signal modulating signal and carrier signal is used because it is a modulation technique, and in digital pulse modulation here also a modulating signal, okay, and carrier signal. Okay, here also modulating signal and carrier signal, but in analog pulse modulation this modulating signal is analog in nature. Analog in nature. Okay, and carrier signal is rectangular pulses. Okay, pulses. So here the carrier is rectangular pulses, so it is called the pulse modulation technique, or it is called the pulse modulation method. And here the modulating signal is analog, so it is called the analog pulse modulation. Okay, and here also in digital pulse modulation the modulating signal is digital. Okay, and carrier signal is also a rectangular pulse. Rectangular pulse. Okay, so here the both carrier from analog pulse modulation and digital pulse modulation, the both carrier are same. Both carrier is same. Which carrier? Rectangular pulse carrier. For this reason, it is called the pulse modulation. Okay, the signal is transmitted in the form of pulses. Means the carrier is rectangular pulses. But when the modulating signal is analog, is called the analog pulse modulation, and when the modulating signal is digital, is called the digital pulse modulation. The example of analog pulse modulation, basically three types: PAM, PPM, and PWM. PAM, PPM, and PWM. PAM is called the pulse amplitude modulation, PPM is called the pulse position modulation, and PWM is called the pulse width modulation. And digital pulse modulation is PCM, which is called the pulse code modulation, and DM is called the delta modulation. Okay, this is the basic idea of pulse modulation technique. Okay, and this is the topic. Thank you.